Silence has a way of settling into a house where a life's gone missing. For a year, since I buried my Annalise, it's been my only constant company. It sits in her empty armchair across from mine, a cold, heavy presence that the roaring fire in the hearth can't seem to warm. Outside, the Montana winter was throwing a fit, the wind howling like a lost soul around the eaves. I stared into the flames, watching them dance and spit. It was the same as every other night, a quiet supper for one, a long, lonely watch by the fire, and the hollow ache of a life that had lost its meaning. My routine was all I had left, a wall I'd built brick by brick to keep the memories from rushing in all at once. That night, though, something else cut through the howl of the wind. It was a cry, so thin and sharp I almost dismissed it. I sat up straighter, my head cocked, listening past the rattle of the window panes. Nothing but the wind and the groan of old wood. I was just hearing things, I told myself. The solitude was finally starting to fray my mind. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. It wasn't an animal caught in the storm. It was human, a whimper of pain, carried on the wind from the direction of the barn. Every part of me went still. A lifetime on this unforgiving land teaches you that strangers in a blizzard mean one thing: desperate trouble. My weariness evaporated, replaced by a cold, familiar caution. I rose from my chair, my joints protesting the suddenness of it. I pulled on my heavy sheepskin coat, its weight a small comfort, and took my Winchester down from its pegs by the door. On the frontier, you learn not to ask questions first. A man alone is a man prepared. The icy air hit me like a fist as I stepped onto the porch. Snow swirled in a furious dance, and I held the lantern high, its light a feeble weapon against the raging dark. I could barely see the barn, but my feet knew the way. The big barn door was unlatched, swaying just enough to let the wind shriek through the gap. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. The familiar smell of hay and livestock was there, but it was tainted with something else, the raw, metallic scent of fear. I raised the lantern, sweeping its beam across the cavernous dark. It slid over empty stalls, over bales of hay stacked high. And then it stopped. There, in the farthest corner, was a miserable heap of humanity. My breath hitched in my chest. At the center of it was a woman, her face bone-pale and streaked with grime. A dark, ugly gash cut across her forehead. Her eyes, wide and wild in the lantern light, locked onto mine, a terrifying mix of defiance and pleading. Huddled around her, shivering under a blanket so thin it was more a prayer than a comfort, were children. A tangle of pale faces and frightened eyes, their breaths pluming like smoke in the frigid air. I counted 1, 2, 7 of them. 7 children, freezing to death in my barn. The woman tried to push herself up, to shield them, but a wave of pain washed over her and she slumped back against the hay with a low moan. For a long moment I just stood there, the rifle in my hand suddenly feeling like a cruel and useless weight. The wind outside sounded like a predator circling. I looked at the woman's wound, at the terror in the children's eyes, and I didn't see a threat. I saw a flame about to be snuffed out. The silence in my house was the quiet of grief. The silence in this barn was the quiet of approaching death. But Terrell. I leaned the Winchester against a post. Words felt useless. I moved slowly, deliberately, so as not to spook them. I unbuttoned my coat, my own warm, heavy coat, smelling of wood smoke and home. I stepped forward and, without a word, I laid it over the woman and the 2 smallest children clinging to her. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes asked the question my actions had yet to answer. In that moment, something broke inside me. The fortress I'd built around my heart to keep the pain out crumbled to dust. I'd been living in a tomb of my own making. But tonight, life, raw, wounded, and desperate, had found its way to my door. I couldn't let it die here. I reached down, my calloused hand offered, not in threat, but in promise. a promise to bring them out of the storm and into the warmth. The short walk from the barn to the house was a fight against a wind that wanted to rip them right out of my grasp. I had my arm around the woman, Clara, I'd learn later, who stumbled with every other step. My other arm was full with the smallest of the lot, a little boy so cold and light he felt like a bundle of sticks. The rest of them scrambled behind us, a tight knot of fear, staying close to the bobbing light of my lantern as if it were the only anchor in a world gone mad. When I pushed my front door open, the warmth hit them like a physical blow. I felt them all stop dead on the threshold, blinking in the steady glow of the room. The fire was roaring in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the worn furniture and wooden floors. To their eyes, I suppose it must have looked like a king's palace. They shuffled inside but stayed huddled by the door, a single shivering organism of mistrust. I didn't say anything. Words weren't what they needed right now. I just pointed a thumb toward the fire. Slowly, one by one, they crept closer, their gazes locked on the flames as if they'd never seen such a thing. The eldest girl, the one with the fierce eyes, took up a position just ahead of the others. A little sentinel, watching my every move. I moved slow and easy, not wanting to make any sudden moves. I put another log on the fire, and the loud crackle it made caused half of them to jump. I went into the kitchen, the familiar squeak of the pump handle and the clang of the pot on the stove sounding foreign with so many listening ears in the other room. I could feel their fear. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for me to tell them what work they had to do to earn this warmth. But I came back carrying a steaming pot, a stack of my wooden bowls, and what was left of a loaf of bread. The smell of the broth filled the room, and I saw the desperate, painful hunger in their eyes. I set it all down on the floor near them. I ladled the broth into a bowl and nudged it forward. A silent offering. Nobody moved. They'd been taught by a cruel world that nothing comes for free. My eyes met the little sentinel's. Lydia. I saw the battle in her face, the suspicion fighting the desperation. I understood it well enough, so I picked up the bowl myself, took a sip of the hot broth, and set it back down. A simple gesture. It's safe. She watched me for a long moment, sizing me up. I could almost see the gears turning in her young, tired mind. Finally, she seemed to decide I wasn't going to poison them. She picked up the bowl, sipped cautiously, and then took a deeper drink. A flicker of relief crossed her face. She gave a sharp nod to her siblings, and that was that. The truce was sealed. They ached with the quiet, desperate haste of the truly starved. Haibuch. While they ate, I tended to their mother. I brought a basin of warm water and some clean cloths. She flinched when I knelt beside her, but she was too weak to pull away. My hands are rough from ranch work, but I did my best to be gentle as I cleaned the gash on her forehead. I worked in silence, just trying to fix what was broken. By the time I was done, the children were a heap of tangled limbs on the rag rug before the fire, their bellies full and the warmth finally winning the war against their fear. Sleep was taking them. It was Lydia who broke the silence. Her voice was small, but as clear as a bell. "You ain't gonna send for the sheriff, are you?" she asked, her chin held high. "Or send us to the workhouse?" I looked from her defiant little face to the sleeping forms of her family. I thought of the crushing silence that usually owned this room, now softened by the sound of their breathing. A sound I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. I shook my head, my voice raspy from a day of not using it. "Not tonight," I said. "Tonight you're just warm and fed, that's all." She stared at me, her gaze steady. She didn't smile, but she gave another one of those sharp little nods. She curled up with the others, her back to the fire, but her face toward me. The truce would hold. For now. And as I watched her watch me, I wondered what she saw in my shadow, dancing on the wall, a protector, or just the keeper of a bigger cage. The silence I'd grown so used to was gone. In its place was something else, a softer quiet, punctuated by small sounds I hadn't heard in over a year. The swish of a broom against the floorboards. The murmur of a woman's voice teaching a boy his letters by the fire. the thud of small, mended socks being placed in a basket. A week passed like that, and a new rhythm started to beat in the heart of my old house. Clara, though still pale, moved with a quiet purpose that reminded me so much of Annalise it sometimes made my chest ache. She stretched my supplies into stews that felt like feasts, and managed the children with a gentle firmness that left no room for argument. She was taking the empty shell I lived in, and was painstakingly turning it back into a home. For my part, I worked the ranch with a focus I hadn't felt in months. Chopping wood wasn't just a chore to pass the time anymore, it was fuel to keep them warm. Mucking out the stalls wasn't a penance. It was work that would eventually put food on the table for 8. I'd catch the children watching me from the window, their fear slowly melting into a shy kind of curiosity. I was the quiet giant who made the fire roar and kept the wolves, both the 4-legged and 2-legged kind, from the door. But our little sanctuary couldn't last forever. With 8 new mouths to feed, the flour sack was getting light and the salt pork was nearly gone. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. As I guided my horse and wagon down the main street, I felt the eyes on me, same as always. But this time was different. The usual nods were replaced with sharp, sideways glances and hushed whispers behind cupped hands. News travels fast in a small town, and bad news travels fastest of all. I tied up outside Miller's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing my arrival with a cheerfulness I sure didn't feel. "Elias Thorne. Haven't seen you in a coon's age," Mr. Miller said, his face neutral. Before I could answer, a voice like nails on a chalkboard cut through the air. "Well, I imagine he's been preoccupied." Prudence Abernathy appeared from behind a rack of dresses, her face alight with righteous curiosity. She was the town crier, judge, and jury, all rolled into one. "Prudence," I said, my voice low. "A warning." She didn't take it. "We heard you had visitors," she pressed, her eyes gleaming. "7 children, Elias? Is that the truth? And a woman, a wounded woman, they say." She leaned forward, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial hiss. "It's hardly proper. A man like you, taking in a woman of unknown character. Are you even sure they're hers?" The poison in her words made my jaw tighten. I slapped my list on the counter. "Flour, 20 pounds, salt pork, and beans." Prudence sniffed, offended I wasn't playing her game. "People are talking, Elias. It's a scandal." I turned my head slow-like and looked her dead in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "They were freezing to death in my barn, Prudence," I said, my voice flat and hard as a winter road. "Now they're warm. That's all the character I needed to know." She took a step back, her mouth clamped shut for once. I paid Miller, loaded my supplies, and got out of there, the little bell marking my retreat. The whole ride home, I felt the town's judgment at my back. A cold I couldn't shake. I walked into the house to the smell of fresh bread. Clara was at the table, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up and smiled, but it faltered when she saw my face. She knew. A woman like her always knows when she's being judged. I set the heavy sack of flour on the table between us. I didn't need to say a word. She knew what I'd faced in town. She reached out and put her hand over mine where it rested on the sack. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, we weren't a host and his guests anymore. We were a fortress of 2, with the whole world laying siege. The town's disapproval was a ghost in the house for the next few days. It was a chill that lingered in the corners, an unspoken thing between Clara and me. We were more watchful of each other now, bound together by the secret of the world's judgment. One evening after the children were asleep, a quiet pile of breathing blankets on the floor, I was oiling a piece of harness by the fire. Across from me, Clara was mending a tear in one of the boys' trousers, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm in the lamplight. "They think I'm a fallen woman, don't they?" she said, her voice soft. She didn't look up from her work. It wasn't really a question. I stopped what I was doing. "They're fools," I said, They see a woman in trouble and mistake it for a flaw in her character. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. She set the trousers down. My own family thought the same. I was promised to a man with land and a hard soul. When I said no, they said I'd brought shame on them. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine. So they cast me out. That's how I learned to be a stray. Her gaze drifted toward the sleeping children, a flicker of fierce tenderness in her eyes. They aren't all mine by blood, she admitted, the words coming out in a quiet rush. Lydia is. The rest, well, a stray learns how to spot other strays. A boy whose father drank himself to death. Twin girls left behind when their mother ran off. They were just souls the world was ready to throw away. I just couldn't let it happen. I looked at her then, and I saw past the tired lines on her face to the woman underneath. She wasn't a victim. She was a protector, with a core of stubborn courage that had been forged in a fire I could only imagine. The name came to my lips before I could stop it. "My Annalise," I said, the word feeling strange after a year of silence. "She would have liked you." I glanced at her empty chair by the fire. She had a laugh that could fill this whole house. When she died, the silence was the loudest thing she left behind, until you came. The words hung in the air between us, a plain and simple truth. It wasn't a declaration, just an admission. An admission that her presence had filled a hole in my life I thought would be empty forever. I saw tears well in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I think she understood. I wasn't offering pity. I was offering a piece of my own story to match a piece of hers. Ah. I got up and walked to the big cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I hadn't opened it since I'd packed her things away. The hinges creaked, and the faint scent of dried lavender and memory filled the air. I returned with a dress in my hands. It was a simple, dark blue wool with a bit of lace at the collar. It was her favorite. I held it out to her. "It's a good, warm dress," I said, my voice thick. "Annalise, she'd have wanted someone to have it. No sense in it gathering dust." Clara looked from the dress to my face. She knew what this cost me. Opening that chest, letting a memory out into the room. This wasn't charity. This was something else. This was me telling her she wasn't a nameless stray anymore. Her hands trembled as she took it from me. She clutched the soft wool to her chest, and I saw a single tear finally trace a path down her cheek. It was the weight of a new beginning, a second name, being settled upon her right there in the quiet of my home. The peace we'd found was a fragile thing. I should have known it wouldn't last. It was Lydia who saw him first. I saw her scramble down from her perch on the fence post, her face tight with a fear I hadn't seen since that first night. "Someone's coming," she said, her voice a strained whisper as she burst through the door. "Riding hard." I was splitting wood by the barn and saw the rider too, a dark speck moving with an angry impatience against the snow. I knew at once this wasn't a friendly visit. I saw Clara's face go white. She knew who it was. She herded the younger children into the back room with a quiet urgency. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." I walked back toward the house, my axe held loose in one hand, and met her on the porch. The rider was close now, his form taking shape. "Go inside, Clara," I said, my voice low. "Elias, you don't understand," she whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "That's Caleb Vance. My husband's brother. He thinks he owns me." Before I could answer, he was there, pulling his horse to a skidding halt that sprayed mud and slush across the porch steps. He was a mean-looking man, with small, cruel eyes and a sneer that looked like it was carved into his face. He swung out of the saddle like he owned the whole world. "So this is where you've been hiding, you worthless stray?" He spat, his eyes fixed on Clara. He didn't even look at me. It was like I was a fence post. "Gather up my brother's brats. You've shamed the family name for the last time." I stepped forward then, planting myself squarely between him and Clara. I felt her take a small step back behind me. "This is my property. I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the land I stood on. And she is under my protection. Caleb finally turned his venomous gaze on me. A smirk twisted his lips. You? And who are you? Some lonely old fool letting this curse take root in your home? He jabbed a finger toward Clara. She's my property now, my brother's burden, and it falls to me. Her and every last whelp she's collected. They belong to me. The air went thick and cold. I could feel the clash between us, his loud, bullying anger against my quiet resolve. He was a storm, but I was a mountain, and I wasn't moving. They belonged to no one, I said, my grip tightening on the smooth wood of the axe handle. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but it was a statement. And they're not leaving. His face turned a blotchy, furious red. He was a man used to getting his way by shouting louder than everyone else. My calm defiance was like throwing gasoline on his fire. You'd stand against me for this trash? He snarled, taking a step closer. I have the law on my side. Family right. There's law, I replied, my voice dropping even lower. And then there's what's right. You're not welcome here. Get on your horse and ride out. I saw his hand drift down toward the pistol at his hip. I'm not leaving without what's mine. From the corner of my eye, I saw a small face pressed against the window pane. One of the children, watching in terror. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about the 7 souls hiding behind my door, listening as the monster from their past tried to drag them back into the dark. I had thought my life was a closed book, but I knew right then I was willing to start a new chapter, written in blood if need be, to defend the family I had somehow found. The world shrank down to the space between me and Caleb Vance. The only sounds were his horse snorting nervously and the low growl of the wind. His hand was on his pistol now, a promise of the violence he was itching to unleash. I didn't move a muscle. My feet were planted on my land, my grip was steady on the axe. Let him try. I'm warning you, old man, he sneered, his fingers tightening on the gun. Step aside. No, I said. The word was flat, final. Just as his knuckles went white, just as I braced for the flash of steel, another sound cut through the tension. The rattle of a buggy. We both turned to see Reverend Shaw pulling up the lane, his face a mask of grave concern. He must have heard the whispers in town and feared the worst. Caleb, the Reverend said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. What is the meaning of this? Stay out of it, preacher. Caleb snapped, thrown off his rhythm. This is a family matter. It looks to me like a matter of a man threatening another on his own property, Reverend Shaw countered, stepping down from his buggy. He wasn't a big man, but his presence had a way of making bullies feel small. But before another word could be said, the front door of my house creaked open. It was Lydia. She stepped out onto the porch, her small face pale but her eyes burning with a righteous fire that put Caleb's blustering rage to shame. She walked right past me and stood beside her mother, taking her hand in a grip that looked strong as iron. Then, one by one, the others followed, the twins, holding hands. The quiet, watchful boy. They filed out and arranged themselves around Clara, a small, silent army. They were trembling, I could see it, but they didn't hide. They didn't cry. They just stood there, their faces turned toward the man who had been the monster in their stories. Hyatt, that was the blow that finally broke him, their quiet courage. Caleb stared, his bravado cracking and falling away in pieces. He'd come for a cowering woman and a handful of scared orphans. He'd come to shout down one lonely man. He hadn't counted on facing a family. He looked from the children's unblinking faces to my steady gaze, and then to the moral certainty in the Reverend's eyes. He was surrounded, not by weapons, but by a wall of decency he couldn't breach. Graya famless Sraf. The fight just drained out of him, leaving nothing but a sour, pathetic anger. They're a curse, he spat, but the words sounded weak, hollow. You'll see. He yanked his horse around and kicked it into a gallop, fleeing not like a victor, but like the coward he was. We all stood there and watched him go, the dust settling back onto the snow. The threat was gone. Reverend Shaw turned to me, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his face. He had come expecting to find scandal. Instead, he'd found something else entirely. "It seems, Elias," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder, "that you have been far busier than any of us knew." I finally loosened my grip on the axe. I looked at Clara and at the 7 children who had chosen to stand their ground with us. The wind had died down, the sun was breaking through the clouds. The house at my back wasn't just my shelter anymore. It was a fortress we had all defended, together. After Caleb Vance was nothing more than a bad memory disappearing over the horizon. A profound quiet settled over the ranch. Reverend Shaw, seeing we were all right, gave me a nod that said more than words ever could, and left us to our peace. I leaned the axe against the porch rail, the tension finally draining from my shoulders. I turned and looked at them. The children, their moment of bravery over, finally let go, rushing to cling to Clara, burying their faces in her skirt. She ran her hands over their hair, her own body trembling with the aftershocks of what had almost happened. Her eyes met mine over their small heads. In that one look, I knew the last wall between us had crumbled. I wasn't just the man who owned the barn anymore, and she wasn't just a guest. We were partners. We'd faced down the dragon together. That evening, after the children were asleep, a peaceful pile of blankets before the fire, Clara and I sat at the kitchen table. The house was still, but it was a comfortable stillness now, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. "I've never felt that before," she said softly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Safe." She looked right at me, her gaze clear as water. "All my life, I've been running. From my family, from hunger, from men like him. Today, when I saw you standing there, I wasn't afraid. Not for myself." "You have a right to feel safe," I said, my voice low. "You and the children." For the first time, she said, and I saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek. "I feel free. He has no power here." She took a deep breath, and I could tell the next words cost her something. "If you were to ask me to stay, Elias, I would." The words hung in the quiet air between us. It wasn't a plea from a desperate woman. It was a choice, freely offered by a strong one. I looked at her, at the woman who had filled the hollow spaces in my house with life, who had mended the silence in my own heart. I thought of the long, empty years I had resigned myself to, and then I thought of a future, with the sound of children's laughter and her steady presence across the table. I'm not a man of pretty words. My feelings are not eloquent things. They're solid and simple, like the earth under my boots. I reached across the table and took her hand in mine. I just held it, my thumb brushing against her knuckles. It was the only way I knew how to say what was in my heart. I didn't need to ask the question. She didn't need to hear it. The answer was in the way her eyes shone in the lamplight, in the way her hand squeezed mine in return. Right there, in the quiet of my kitchen, a silent promise was made. We were 2 lonely souls who had found an anchor in each other. Clara wasn't a stray I had taken in anymore. She was choosing to stay. And I, the solitary man, was choosing to let her, and to never let her go. Spring finally came, chasing the last of the snow from the high pastures. On a mild, sun-drenched afternoon, we had a wedding. Not in a church, but in the barn, the very place where I'd found them. We'd swept it clean, and the air smelled of fresh hay and new beginnings. Sunlight streamed through the open doors, lighting up the dust motes like 1,000 tiny golden stars. The children sat in a row on a bale of hay, all scrubbed and shining, their faces full of a quiet, serious joy. Behind them sat Reverend Shaw and Mr. Miller from the mercantile. They weren't there to gawk. They were there as witnesses. Clara stood beside me in that blue wool dress I'd given her. It looked like it belonged on her. I stood in a clean work shirt, my hands feeling too large and rough for the occasion, but steady all the same. The Reverend kept it short. "We are not gathered here to create a family," he said, his voice filling the quiet barn. "We are here to recognize the one that has already been forged in this place, through compassion, courage, and a love that gave shelter from the storm." I turned to Clara and took her hands in mine. "This is your home now," I said, the words thick in my throat. Her eyes shone as she smiled. "It is our home," she corrected me softly, and just like that, it was done. But the real ceremony happened a few minutes later. Clara came out of the house holding a small, tattered piece of gray cloth, a scrap from the dress she'd been wearing that first night. We walked together, the children trailing behind us, up to the little slope under the big cottonwood tree where I had buried Annalise. The air there was always peaceful. I took a spade and dug a small hole in the rich, dark earth, a few feet from Annalise's marker. I wasn't disturbing her rest. I was adding to it. Clara knelt and placed the scrap of fabric in the hole. It was a burial. She was burying the ghost of the hunted nameless woman she had been forced to be for so long. Together we pushed the soil back over it. My hand brushed against hers in the dirt. I wasn't replacing a memory, I was planting a new life beside it. The love I had for Annalise made me the kind of man who could open his barn door that night. The love I was building with Clara would make this house a home again. That evening I sat in my armchair and listened. A child was humming by the fire. Clara was moving about the kitchen. Lydia was patiently reading a story aloud to the younger ones. The house was no longer filled with a crushing silence. It was filled with the gentle, promising rhythm of life. The town had been shocked, all right. But they weren't shocked by scandal, they were shocked by the quiet miracle of how a family, my family, had grown right here in the heart of my lonesome ranch.